Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending. My name is Marlene Tobar. For those of you who don't know me, although I think I know the majority of you, I'm a PhD candidate in the Writing, Rhetorics, and Literacies program.
And I'm Mark James, Associate Professor in the English Department.
Yes, and today we're going to review some practical strategies to facilitate learning transfer in writing courses. And this is just a brief overview of what we're going to be covering. So we'll start by writing a very brief definition of learning transfer. Then we're going to discuss the transfer problem. I'll delve back into high road and low road transfer. We'll share some assignments that you all could adopt in your or implement in your own classes to facilitate learning transfer. And then we're going to ask you to consider how you might actually implement these activities in 107 or 108 or any language classes that you're teaching. Okay, so let's start with the definition of what learning transfer is. So according to Perkins and Salomon, transfer of learning occurs when learning in one context enhances, that is, it might lead to positive transfer, or undermines, meaning it leads to negative transfer, of related performance in another context. So there's different examples of positive transfer. When you're learning a language that's similar to your first language, for instance, if you're a Spanish speaker and you're learning Italian, then there's the high possibility of positive transfer occurring because of the similar grammatical structures between the two languages, as well as the similar phonetic system. Negative transfer conversely occurs when if you're learning a language that's vastly different from your native tongue, then you might struggle to learn a different language, especially if the vocabulary, phonetic system, and syntax is different. Other examples of positive transfer occurring, if you are teaching students in a first year writing class some skills that they could use in a philosophy class, they might be able to see the similarities between those two learning contexts and easily transfer what they learn. In contrast, negative transfer might occur if they attempt to transfer skills from first year writing to an algebra course where they might not see a lot of similarities and focus more on the differences between the two. Okay, so that's the definition. And I think we have an example, right?
Yeah, we got some examples, yeah. So Marlene and I are going to go back and forth through this first part of the workshop before we get into the practical activities to show you. So that's the abstract definition, the general definition of learning transfer that we're working with. But let's take a look at what this means. What does this look like? I'm going to show us a short video. 30 seconds, it's just a commercial. Okay? Here's an example of learning transfer.
Blue shoes.
Blue shoes.
Red ball.
Red ball.
Green rabbit.
Green rabbit.
Let's just focus. Blue beetle.
Blue beetle.
Orange kid.
Orange kid.
You got it?
Yeah, got it. Situation update. 39-year-old male. Significant blood loss. Temperature 820. BP 80. Over 60.
Listening is a key skill that will set you up for your future career. Learn more with Barclays Life Skills.
That's it. Okay. So I was just browsing on YouTube and found that commercial. I thought it was a nice example of learning transfer. You see what's happening here. It's a school or training situation. The students are learning, or they're practicing memorizing words in that context. Oops, sorry. And the whole purpose is that they will then go into a work situation, and that's going to help them somehow. So that would be an example of, what we saw was an example of positive transfer, right? Learning in one context, in that classroom situation where they were practicing with the teacher, enhances a related performance in another context. When that person was out working as a first responder with a helicopter, the person was able to memorize the situation, details about the situation, and report those. So that's an example of positive transfer. So with that in mind, let's try this out. We've now watched an example. We're going to show you some pictures, and don't say anything. I want you to look at the picture, and if you think you know what it is, please put up your hand. 2 people have their hands up. Only 2. Don't say anything. Okay, now we're going to give you a hint And the same question, if you think you know what that picture is, please put up your hand. Okay, we're on the next slide. So now, if you think you know, this is your hint, if you think you know what that is, put up your hand. Not everybody, almost everybody, not everybody. That's interesting, okay. We're gonna do it again. I'm gonna show you a different picture. If you know what it is, if you think you know what it is, just hand up. Don't say anything, just hand up. Okay. If you think you know what that is, hand up. No one thinks they know what that is. Okay, here's a hint. Hand up if you think you know, just one. Okay, two. One more hint, okay. Hand up if you think you know what it is. Okay, great. We'll try one more time. There's going to be another picture. If you think you know what it is, hand up. Okay. If you think you know, hand up. Maybe, a couple of hands. Okay, now we're going to give you another hint. If you think you know what the original picture is, right here, hand up. Only a couple of hands up. Interesting. Okay. What we're illustrating here is transfer. This is learning transfer because we all know, in our past experience, we know what a frog is, we know what a cow is, and we know what a nose is. Right? We look at a nose every day in the mirror. We know what a nose is. But when we looked at the pictures, each of those three pictures, before we had the hints, most of us didn't make that connection. All right? We didn't immediately see the frog. We didn't immediately see the cow. We didn't immediately see the nose. So this is an example of how transfer works. When you got the hint, suddenly your brain was able to make that connection. Suddenly you transferred your learning. You transferred what you already knew about what a frog is, what a cow is, and what a nose is. Suddenly you made that connection. So this is transfer, right? This is what we're hoping in education contexts, this is what we're hoping to see happen. So as humans, we do this all the time. This is how our brains work, making connections like this. In education contexts, it's particularly important because this is the goal of what we're doing, right? When we teach a class, we're hoping that students will learn something and then make those connections when they leave the class. That's the whole point of teaching, the whole point of education. But it doesn't always happen. As we've just illustrated, it doesn't always happen, even when you know something as well as you know a frog and a cow and a nose. It doesn't always happen. Here's an example. Thanks, Molly. So there's a transfer problem. We know what transfer is, but there's a transfer problem. Here's an example going way back. This is not a new problem. This goes way back. This is something that was written by philosopher John Locke more than 300 years ago. This is just a nice example of the transfer problem. A young gentleman who, having learned to dance, and that to great perfection, there happened to stand an old trunk in the room where he learned. The idea of this remarkable piece of household stuff had so mixed itself with the turns and steps of all his dances that though in that chamber he could dance excellently well, yet it was only while that trunk was there. Nor could he perform well in any other place, unless that or some such other trunk had its due position in the room. The English is a little old. Yeah, the English is it's older, so I struggle a little bit putting all this together. But basically what philosopher John Locke is saying with this example is that this person learned to dance in a room where there was some furniture, a trunk, and if this person went to a different room where there was no trunk, he couldn't dance as well for some reason. This is an example of the transfer problem, right? For some reason, the trunk had to be present for him to be able to dance as well as he did in the original room. We'll take a look. So this is a kind of a general example, but let's take a look at a more recent example, specifically in education. So yeah, thanks, Martin. This is an example that's described in a chapter on learning transfer, referring specifically to a physics class, a university physics class. In this physics class, students learned how to solve problems like this. How long will it take for this ball to fall from the top of the tower to the ground? Okay, so they learned in class how to do that. And this is working with the principles of gravity, acceleration, things like this. At the end of the course, a test had this question. How long will it take for this ball to fall to the bottom of this hole? So you can see what should happen here. This is what they learned. This is what they were tested on. But some students complained about this test. They said, we weren't given any hole questions in class. So they didn't make the connection. They learned how to do this when they were talking about a tower, but they didn't apply it to this situation, which looks exactly the same. But they didn't make that connection. So there's some kind of a problem here with transfer. This is within the same course. This is with two activities that look almost the same. So imagine what happens for us when we're teaching courses and we're expecting that students are going to take what they learn and apply it outside our class, in new situations, in new courses, outside campus, things like this, right? So if it doesn't happen here, what happens in those situations? So I think that's it for the transfer problem, and we're going to go back over now to Marlene, who's going to take over and talk a little bit more about transfer, some specific things about transfer.
Yes, thank you. So the example that Dr. James just presented is one that you could say requires pyro transfer to an extent. But let me backtrack and briefly define these two different types of transfer. So low-road transfer refers to the automatic triggering of well-learned behavior in a new context. So for instance, if you're learning how, or you know how to drive a car, and then you're tasked with driving a truck, you can easily apply what you know about driving a car when you get behind the wheel and attempt to drive a truck. Of course, there's some differences, but you can easily, perceive the similarities in the two situations. So it's easy to transfer what you know, those skills of driving, when driving a new type of vehicle that's just a little bit larger. High road transfer, on the other hand, occurs by deliberative, quote-unquote, mindful abstraction. So it requires you to either reach backward or forward when attempting to apply skills to a new situation. So for example, when you are, let's say, studying for a test, then you can easily draw on what you learned perhaps in a college course on student success. It was a required course for many first-year students that teaches you how to manage your time, and you can easily apply that later because you learned that skill. It's one that's an example of forward-reaching transfer, because you can easily think about how that skill will be applied in a situation in the future. Whereas backward-reaching transfer occurs when you have to recall when you learned a specific skill in another situation and consider how applicable it is to the new situation in which you need to perhaps perform some task or some activity. So a good example of that would be when you are, let's say, this was an example actually in Perkins and Salomon's article, when you are out shopping and you're trying to control yourself from overspending. Let's say when you were younger, you were out in the supermarket throwing a tantrum and your mother taught you to count to 10. So then when you're out shopping, you recall that situation and you're able to refrain from overspending. So that's one example. So high road transfer requires a specific skill. Can anyone guess how or what specific kind of skill this kind of explicitly conscious formulation of abstraction requires? When you have to think back to a task or a skill that you learned in order to apply it in a new context. Any guesses?
Maybe connection skills, like, if they learn something from us, like from English classroom, they may think differently from like the physics and the other areas of study, and then they don't know how to make a connection.
Connection,
Yeah.
okay, that's close. Eva?
Yeah, a word that just occurred to me, common underlying proficiency in applied linguistics. And I think to translate, my understanding is if you can see through the differences on the surface and you can delve into the underlying part that is actually very similar on the abstract term.
Yeah. Good. Did you also?
Yeah, my guess would be that you would have to prune out the concrete facts about certain contexts in order to come up with a more abstract knowledge or understanding of what you have learned in a particular context, so that it is therefore more applicable in the other context. So if you translate something specific to something more generalizable rule or principles, then I think that would be more applicable to other cases.
Great. So, you all gave really great responses, but it's actually, and I think it's connected to metacognition. So we've all heard this term before, right? Metacognition refers to the knowledge about and regulation of one's cognitive activities and learning processes. So in a way, you're right. All of you were right. You have to, metacognition is basically thinking about your thinking, you're recalling information or strategies that you learned in a previous situation and considering how applicable it is. And part of that also involves, Eva, I like the response you gave because it does involve like decoding the new situation in order to figure out, is this strategy that I learned in the past really suitable for this situation, or is there a need for like maybe a repurposing or reshaping of what I learned, right? So metacognition is also a type of self-monitoring. So you're thinking about what you've done before and you're consciously applying that skill in this new situation. Okay, so it's a lot like a puzzle in a way, where you're kind of drawing back to your memory and thinking about what piece is needed in a new situation. And I'm going to hand it back to Dr. James, who will discuss the transfer discussions.
Yeah, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at a couple of examples of practical activities that we think all of us can use in our classes to promote transfer. So I'm going to talk about one which we're calling transfer discussions, and in a few minutes Marlene's going to talk about another one which we're calling transfer reflections. Okay, and then after we've described these two, we're going to ask you to talk amongst yourselves. We've got some questions for you about these. For example, how do you think you can apply these in your own teaching, okay? So bear with us for a few minutes. We're just going to describe the practical examples, and then we're going to throw it back to you to think about how you can apply these ideas. And by the way, these two examples we're going to focus on fit into what Marlene was just saying about low road transfer, high road transfer. High road transfer is related to metacognition. Both of these examples fit into that way of promoting transfer. We can talk, if you like, later about ways to promote low road transfer, but we're focusing here on this high road transfer, metacognition. One of the main reasons we're doing that is because this kind of transfer, there's two main ways that transfer happens. This kind of transfer is generally seen as having greater reach, right? So if we're going to try to help our students to transfer learning, as much as possible, if we can do it along the high road, which means involving metacognition, that transfer has the potential to go much farther, right? If it's low road transfer, it's more automatic, it happens in more limited situations. Still important, but it typically doesn't go as far. So that's why we're focusing on this high road transfer. Anyway, transfer discussion. So this is the first practical suggestion we have for you. We're defining this as frequent, for example, weekly homework, frequent online discussions in which students individually think about where and how they can transfer learning from the writing course. Simple idea, and this is what it looks like. For example, we might have each week, and these ideas that we're sharing today, these two main ideas, are things we do in our own classes. We do research on them, things like that. So this is something you have on Canvas, a weekly discussion with a prompt that focuses specifically on transfer. It's designed in a way to get the students to do what we call forward-reaching transfer. So it might be something like this. In Unit 1 in our textbook, whatever we've been focusing on this week, you used a cluster diagram to brainstorm ideas to write about. Where outside our course can you immediately use cluster diagrams, for example? So the learning point here is cluster diagrams. And it could be anything, whatever you're focusing on that week in that unit in the textbook. The students can be asked to think about that and where can they apply it. So then the students might write something like this. Now each student is going to write something, right? It's a posting like on Canvas. I can use cluster diagrams in my Introduction to Psychology course. For the course's midterm assignment, due in 2 weeks, I have to write a 2-page paper about whether recovered memories should be allowed in court cases. For example, a criminal case where a witness has a new memory of being abused as a child. When I start that paper, I can use a cluster diagram to brainstorm ideas, like the different concerns about recovered memories. For example, memories can be planted under hypnosis. So that's just an example of what a student might write in response to that prompt. So now we'll go to the next slide because I'm going to show you that there are different types of prompts that you could use for transfer discussions. Thanks, Marlene. So the prompt we just looked at is what I would consider a specific focus. It's focusing the students on one target learning outcome. Cluster diagrams. That's something we did in our class. Cluster diagrams, let's focus on that. In Unit 1 in our textbook, you used a cluster diagram to brainstorm ideas to write about. Where outside our course can you immediately use cluster diagrams, for example? But you could also give students choices. I've tried all of these in my own classes. With choices, you might say something like this. Unit 1 in our textbook describes 3 ways to develop ideas in writing. Giving reasons, giving examples, and giving explanations. Outside our course, which of these ways do you use the most, for example? Okay, so now we're getting them to think about transfer, but they're not choosing one, they're not focusing only on one target learning outcome, they're having to choose from among 3. It depends on what your textbook, what your curriculum is focusing on that week. Are you focusing on a variety of things or one main thing? You could choose a different type of prompt depending on that. You could also have a fully open prompt. In Unit 1 in our textbook, describes ways you can develop your ideas in writing. What is one idea from this unit that you can use immediately outside our course? Where and how, for example? So this is open. They can choose whatever idea they want from the textbook to talk about. Okay. So that's what the prompts could look like, and I'll show you one more slide for this transfer discussions. This is what you can do as a result of the discussion. After all the students have posted everything, I create something like this. Yeah, that's it. Great. So this can culminate in a class discussion of where students think they can transfer learning. So this is a graphic that I created, that I would create for my class, and I would do this each week, right? Create something like this. Okay, everybody, we did the discussion for homework. Let's take a look at what happened in our discussion. So in the middle of the diagram, I've got the prompt, right? In Unit 1 in our textbook, you used a cluster diagram to brainstorm ideas to write about. Where outside our course can you immediately use cluster diagrams, for example? And now I've created a part of the graphic shows where each of the students said that they would transfer learning, right? So we've got all these different courses, right? Nicholas said I would use it in my FMS 110 Introduction to New Media course. Isaiah said I would use it in my Kinesiology 101 Introduction to Kinesiology course. Hyung-Hee said I would use it in Philosophy 101, right? So now we've got this graphic we can talk about in class. I would put this up and say, okay, everybody check this out. This is kind of interesting. Do you notice any patterns here? Where's the most interesting connection? Who's transferring learning the farthest? So we can have these kinds of discussions. We can also ask, let's hear a couple of examples. Vera, can you tell us how you used or how you would use cluster diagrams in your Introduction to Geology course? Can you say a little bit more about that? Lin, can you tell us about the merchandising course? How would you use it in your merchandising course? Keep in mind, this is stuff that they've already done for homework, right? So they're ready to talk about it. So that's what I would do. And the key here is that it's regular. This is something we would do every week. And we don't have to talk about it in class because they've already done the background work for homework, but we can. We can put this up and we can have a quick discussion just to try to raise everybody's awareness of transfer and ultimately to try to create a kind of a transfer culture in the class. So that's one example of something we can do, transfer discussions. And now Marlene's going to describe another one, and then we'll throw it back to you to talk about this.
So I typically have my 107, 108 students, and even business writing. So these are some examples of prompts that I have students in business writing or ENG 107 complete after each major writing project to get them to think about what skills. First, I want them to kind of reflect on specific concepts and strategies that we covered during that specific unit, during those 4 to 5 weeks in which we worked on a specific assignment. So I have them consider how they actually applied those strategies in the first writing project. So these are reflections where they think about, they always complete these at the end of each major writing project, and so they have to give examples as well. So I usually have them go back to the draft that they submitted so that they can actually quote themselves or paraphrase something that they wrote to demonstrate that they applied a specific concept or skill in their own writing. Then I have them in the second one do the same thing. So describe a few concepts or writing strategies that you learned during this module. How did you apply these concepts or strategies in project 1? Include specific examples from your final draft of project 1 to support your claim. So this is a reflection, so it is not a formal paper, but they are still making specific arguments about what they learned and what skills they implemented. In the next assignment, this is the one that follows after project 2, what new concepts and or strategies did you learn during module 2? Were there any concepts and or writing strategies from project 1 that you found relevant to apply in project 2? So I want them to consider again how they are still using the concepts and strategies that they learned from their work in the first project in the second project. And as each task increases in complexity, it becomes important too that they are able to still think about what they already know, what they learned, and how they're kind of just building on those skills in the subsequent assignment. And the final project asked them, what new concepts and or strategies did you learn during module 3? Were there any concepts and or writing strategies from either projects 1 or 2 that you found relevant to apply in project 3? For example, so again, I'm asking them to quote themselves or paraphrase something that they wrote in their assignment, in the final draft of their project 3 assignment. And I also asked them to consider how they might apply that. So my assignments, my reflections are a little bit more broad. I just asked them to only think about how they might use that beyond this writing classroom. It doesn't have to be another academic context. It could just be any context, even outside of school. But I have them think about, just in general, based on everything that you learn in projects 1, 2, and 3, what do you think is going to be transferable in other situations? Okay, so this is an example. And this is a student's response from my business writing class. So the reflection prompt is to the left. What new concepts and strategies did you learn during module 2? So this is their response for that prompt question, where I asked them if they applied anything from project 1 to project 2. And thus they said, as I moved from project 1 to project 2, I discovered that maintaining professionalism and clarity was a seamless transition. However, project 2 introduced me to the idea of composing negative messages. So I had them do a business correspondence. That was the assignment they worked on in project 2. The first project was a professional bio, where it was more personal. They wrote in third person, but they still had to maintain a neutral professional tone. So that's what they mean in the first part of their response. It was particularly helpful to use buffer statements before breaking bad news, and I can see how this tactic preserves professionalism and goodwill. So here, they're discussing how they applied what they previously learned, and also explaining what it is that they learned, the new concept that they learned and applied in their writing. I guess we'll move on to the discussion
Yeah, I
questions.
think so, right? Yeah. So yeah, those are our 2 practical activities that we wanted to share today. And again, we've both used these in our own teaching and in our research as well in different ways. So now we want to throw it back over to you. So maybe if you could find someone who you're sitting near, and what time is it? 2:30.